For over 4 centuries, a silence has lingered between Africa and its stolen children. A silence so deep it echoed across oceans and generations. But today, that silence is being broken, not by diplomats, nor by institutions, but by a single voice speaking not as a president, but as a brother. My name is Ibrahim Traore. I am 35 years old. I lead Burkina Faso. But today I speak to you not as a leader, but as your kin, your African brother. With those words, a moment began. One that's never happened before. He wasn't offering aid. He wasn't making a speech for applause. He was calling his family home. And now he's asking you, yes you, to listen to a story that was hidden for 400 years. A story of pain, of power, of reunification, and perhaps of home. Stay with us. This isn't just about a leader. It's about the home our ancestors whispered about. If you believe in healing what history broke, subscribe and walk this road with us, because Africa isn't just calling, it's rising. It was 3 o'clock in the morning in Ouagadougou, the kind of hour when silence holds the whole city hostage. But President Ibrahim Traore wasn't asleep. He sat alone in his study, eyes fixed on the soft glow of a computer screen, burdened not just by the weight of a nation, but by a gnawing question that refused to let him rest. He had spent the day grappling with familiar battles, insurgent threats, the residue of French neo-colonial control, broken promises from international donors. But none of that compared to what he saw in that hour. On his screen flickered images from America. He watched, in grainy footage and handheld angles, the face of George Floyd pressed into pavement, the name of Breonna Taylor chanted by tearful protesters, streets of Minneapolis and Detroit engulfed in fire and defiance, and something in him cracked open. He didn't just see Americans protesting systemic injustice, he saw himself. He saw his soldiers standing guard against a different kind of occupation. He saw the youth of Burkina Faso, bold, hungry, disillusioned. He saw a fire burning on both continents, identical in flame, only divided by ocean. That night, he did what no military training or presidential briefing had prepared him for. He picked up the phone and called his grandmother. She was 89, the guardian of family history, a living archive of memory and myth. When she answered, he told her everything, what he had seen, what he had felt. And then he asked, with the hesitant heart of a child and the hope of a generation, "Grandmother, when our people were taken across the ocean, did we ever stop believing they were still our family?" There was silence, long enough to feel eternal. Then her voice broke through, weathered but unshaken. "Ibrahim," she said. Every night for 400 years, African mothers looked up at the stars and wondered if their stolen children were looking at the same sky. Every harvest season we set aside food for the ones who never returned, but we never stopped claiming them, never stopped singing for them, never stopped waiting for them to remember who they are. He wept, not as a president, as a grandson, as a son of the continent, as a man who suddenly understood that the Atlantic was not a boundary, it was a scar. From that night, the separation no longer felt like history, it felt like injury. Engineered, maintained, and enforced. And something else bloomed, resolve. 6 months later, a letter arrived at his desk. It wasn't official correspondence. It didn't come from a government or embassy. It came from A woman named Dr. Aisha Williams, a professor at Howard University in Washington, D.C. But it wasn't an academic letter, it was a confession, a cry, a call. Dr. Williams had spent 3 years tracing her family's lineage through DNA tests, oral, history and archives. What she discovered stunned her. Her ancestors came from the Mossi Kingdom, the very heart of Burkina Faso. She found the name of her ancestral village. She uncovered great-great-grandparents she never knew existed. But after all the research, after all the data and science and history, she was left with a question. "Mr. President," she wrote, "I know where I come from now. I found my people. I found my history. But I don't know how to come home. I don't know how to bridge the gap between who I was before slavery and who I've become after 400 years in America. I don't know if there's still a place for me." He read the letter 17 times, and every time he felt the same thing. Shame. How could a daughter of Africa, brilliant, searching,
full of love, feel like a stranger in her homeland?
That same night, Traore picked up the phone again. This time, he called Howard University. When Dr. Williams answered, confused and stunned, she heard the words that would change her life forever. "Dr. Williams," he said, "this is Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. I received your letter, and I have one thing to tell you. You are not a stranger here. You are a daughter returning home. And we have been waiting for you." What followed was a 3-hour conversation, not between president and professor, but between brother and sister, between the descendant of those who stayed and the descendant of those who were taken. That call would do more than close the loop on one family's separation. It would ignite a chain reaction of reunions that no one, not even the president himself, could have foreseen. After the call with Dr. Aisha Williams, something shifted inside President Ibrahim Traore. He realized that the bridge between Africa and its diaspora would not be built by governments, NGOs, or foreign aid. It would be built by family. Quietly, discreetly, and without fanfare, he began reaching out, not to politicians or celebrities, but to everyday titans, African Americans who had built excellence in the shadows of systems never designed for them. His first message was to Marcus Johnson, a software engineer from Oakland, California. Marcus had been following Traore's presidency and was intrigued by his pan-African stance. When he received a personal message from the president of Burkina Faso, he thought it was spam. "African presidents don't call random black Americans," he would later say. But when they spoke, Traore told him, "You're not random. Your great-grandmother came from West Africa. Your brilliance in tech is not separate from African innovation. It is its continuation. Your struggle in Silicon Valley mirrors our struggle with neocolonialism." Marcus was stunned. He agreed to visit, not as a tourist, but as a relative. Returning home, what happened during those 2 weeks transformed everything. On his first day, Traore brought him to meet the country's brightest young tech minds, students and developers working with basic tools but boundless ingenuity. Marcus came expecting to mentor. Instead, he was humbled. "These aren't kids needing my help," he said. "They're peers, colleagues. We are part of the same ecosystem, just raised in different zip codes." By the end of that week, Marcus didn't just stay. He invested, not with charity, not as a donor, but as a co-founder. Together with the president's innovation team, he launched a fintech company, building financial tools designed by Africans for Africans and scalable to the diaspora. But what moved him most wasn't the code or capital. It was the healing. "For the first time in my career," he confessed, "I wasn't the token, I wasn't exceptional, I was just normal. a black man doing tech surrounded by other black professionals, and that normality was revolutionary. Word spread. Soon after, Dr. Michael Thompson, a top cardiovascular surgeon from Chicago, contacted the president. "I've spent my life proving black excellence in medicine," he said. "But I've never had the chance to just be excellent, without proving it first. What if we built something new, something ours?" He and Traore spoke for 4 hours about African-run medical schools, hospitals rooted in cultural knowledge, healing that honored both science and spirit. By the end of the call, Dr. Thompson committed 6 months to Burkina Faso and vowed to bring others, and he did. He connected Traore with Dr. Kesha Williams, a renewable energy expert frustrated by US red tape, ready to electrify Africa. Robert Jackson, a financial analyst who believed that economic liberation in Africa was inseparable from black empowerment in America. Angela Davis Brown, an education visionary whose methods had transformed learning outcomes for marginalized youth. Each one introduced another, a chain of reconnection built not on fame, but on purpose. This was not an exodus from America. These were not people fleeing the West. They were coming home to build, not just for Africa, but with Africa. And then came the turning point. 6 months after the call with Dr. Thompson, Traore made the boldest move of his presidency. He hosted a private virtual summit, no media, no official press releases, just 50 of the most accomplished African Americans across medicine, tech, finance, education, and the arts. The summit was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 8. He opened with no pomp, no politics, just truth. "My brothers and sisters," he said, "I believe we are living through a moment that comes once every 500 years. We have the chance to reunite a family scattered by slavery and to build what neither of our communities could build alone." Then he laid out the vision, an Africa that processes its own resources, manufactures its own goods, develops its own technology, educates and heals with its own expertise. But he was clear. This cannot happen without you. Your minds, your skills, your networks. We don't need your money. We need your minds. The response was overwhelming. Marcus Johnson announced he was relocating permanently to help build the African tech sector from scratch. Dr. Thompson unveiled plans to co-found a medical university across 3 African nations, merging modern medicine with traditional healing. Dr. Williams shared a blueprint for renewable energy projects powered by Diaspora expertise. Robert Jackson proposed a financial system allowing African Americans to invest directly in African infrastructure, bypassing bureaucratic aid. And then Angela Davis Brown stood. Her voice trembled with conviction. "I've spent my life trying to save black children from school systems that were never built for them. But what if we stopped fixing what's broken and started building what's beautiful? What if we created new schools in Africa that could teach America how to love black excellence, not just tolerate it?" There were tears, there were cheers, and there were commitments. By the end of the summit, they had pledged $75 million in investment. They had created a Pan-African network, a movement, but more than money, they had done something far rarer. They had reconnected bloodlines that power had tried to erase. But just as the bridges were forming, the storm clouds gathered. The excitement from the summit still hung in the air when the first warning signs appeared. At first, they were subtle. A few postponed calls, delayed approvals, an awkward silence from usual allies. But then the pressure came. Fast, calculated, and unmistakably coordinated. Within 2 weeks of the virtual summit, Traore received an urgent request for a private meeting from the French ambassador to Burkina Faso. Officially, it was to discuss bilateral trade relations. Unofficially, it was a thinly veiled inquisition. The ambassador asked pointedly about Traore's growing international activities and the influence of non-traditional partners. He warned of instability and reminded the president that development requires reliable alliances. The next blow came from the World Bank. A major infrastructure loan, long negotiated and all but approved, was suddenly under additional review. No reasons were given, no timeline provided, but insiders whispered of concerns from donor states about the president's direction. Then came the headlines. American media outlets, often indifferent to African affairs, suddenly began publishing op-eds. Is Burkina Faso's young leader overreaching? Concerns grow over radical diaspora partnerships in West Africa. New Pan-African agenda may invite geopolitical risk. But the pressure wasn't only institutional, it turned personal. One by one, the African-American partners involved in the reunion movement began to feel the heat. Dr. Thompson, the Chicago-based heart surgeon, was summoned to a board meeting by his hospital. They questioned whether his involvement in foreign projects presented a conflict of interest. Marcus Johnson received a call from one of his investors in Silicon Valley. They were concerned that his African commitments might dilute his focus. Angela Davis Brown was visited at home by representatives from the U.S. Department of Education. They wanted to ask about her international education ventures. Robert Jackson's longtime financial clients began pulling out, suddenly unsure if his African projects aligned with their investment profile. Each incident was subtle, deniable, but the pattern was clear. Someone, somewhere, was watching. And they were worried. Traore knew the risks of defiance. He had studied the fate of those who came before him. And then the past came knocking in the present. At 2 o'clock in the morning, his phone rang. The voice on the other end had a French accent, polite, calm, cold. "President Traore," the voice said, "you are young, bold, and full of potential. But your recent actions, your meetings, your connections with the diaspora are being monitored closely. There are those who feel your leadership may be drifting beyond acceptable bounds." Traore remained silent. The voice continued. "You speak of building new systems, but Africa is complex. It needs stability. It needs experienced guidance. It needs partnerships that are tried and tested, not experiments born from American radicalism." Then came the line that chilled him. "You know what happened to Thomas Sankara? He had similar dreams. You would do well to avoid his mistakes." The message was clear. This was not advice. It was a threat. They weren't just uncomfortable with his vision, they were afraid of it, afraid of what it meant for the global order, afraid of a black world connected on its own terms. But what they didn't understand, or what they could
never understand as he saw it, was this: he had already gone too far to turn back. Traore wasn't building this for applause or ambition. He was building because it was just, because it was necessary.
because the soul of Africa and the dignity of its diasporas demanded it, and he was no longer alone. Despite the pushback, the intimidation, the threats, something deeper had already taken root. The diaspora was not retreating. They were rallying, professional, began forming encrypted communication networks. Committees were formed to protect and document the intimidation tactics they faced. Independent African media began to cover the story. framing it not as a scandal, but as a rebirth. Elders in Burkina Faso started speaking in village gatherings about a homecoming long prophesied. Young people, taught on both sides of the Atlantic, began asking questions they'd never dared to ask before. Could we really reconnect? Could we really build? Could we really lead together? Traore knew the answer. But it wasn't his answer to give, it was yours. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Africa can do it in the comments below. Because no matter how loud the opposition grew, the reunion was already too alive to be silenced. As pressure mounted from old powers, new voices began to rise from unexpected corners of the world. From Brazil, where over half the population carries African ancestry, black leaders began reaching out. They had seen Traore's summit, watched his speeches. Read about the $75 million Diaspora initiative, and they asked a simple question: can we be part of this too? In the Caribbean, government officials from Jamaica, Barbados and Trinidad sent discreet messages to Burkina Faso's foreign ministry. They weren't seeking aid or symbolism. They were looking for blueprints, for ways to replicate the connection between continental Africa and its global family. Even in Europe, long a home of African migration and exile, youth-led black communities began forming their own chapters of the reunion movement. The map was shifting, but perhaps the most powerful wave came from within the United States itself. Not from government, but from the people. Historically, black colleges and universities, Howard, Morehouse, Spelman, Fisk, reached out, not with honorary letters, but with curriculum proposals, faculty exchanges, student bridges. Professional associations representing black doctors, engineers, artists, and entrepreneurs opened back channels to Traore's team. Not to talk, but to act. Black-owned business networks began exploring investment corridors that bypassed traditional aid models and connected directly with African markets. Black churches, many of which had never mentioned Africa from the pulpit, began holding special services honoring the diaspora reconnection, and the message was clear. This was no longer a moment, it was becoming a movement, a systematic realignment, a mutual rediscovery, a sacred remembering. Ibrahim Traore understood that this was now bigger than him, bigger than Burkina Faso, bigger even than the diaspora. It was Africa rising, and it was no longer waiting for permission. In one late night call, an elder from Ghana said it best: "What you've done, President Traore, is reopen a door that was closed by force. We are not walking through it as beggars, we are walking through it as builders." And the builders were coming from Chicago to Kingston, from Salvador to London, from Atlanta to Accra, each carrying a different skill, each carrying the same fire. But no matter how wide the doors opened, there was still one question left unanswered. President Ibrahim Traore now stood at a crossroads, not alone, but with millions walking behind him. The question wasn't, can we reconnect? That had already been answered. The new question was far deeper. What are we ready to build together? He painted a picture of the future, not just for Burkina Faso, but for a global African family bold enough to rise. He saw African-American students enrolling at universities in Lagos, Accra, and Nairobi, not as international students, but as children returning to their educational heritage. He saw African students studying at Howard, Spelman, and Morehouse, not as foreigners, but as descendants of those who built those institutions with struggle and brilliance. He saw doctors trained across 2 continents, fluent in both modern medicine and ancestral healing. He saw renewable energy plants designed by African American engineers and powered by African sun. He saw financial systems built without colonial middlemen, where value flowed directly between African innovation and African American capital. He saw African American retirees choosing to spend their final decades not in isolation, but in legacy, mentoring the next generation from Ghanaian towns and Burkina villages, and most of all, he saw young black children in Chicago, in Dakar, in Kingston, in Nairobi, growing up knowing one undeniable truth. We were never meant to be separate. That truth was the key to everything. Because if we accept that our division was engineered, then we must also accept that our reunion can be designed. And designing means choosing to invest, choosing to connect, choosing to co-create systems no one will ever take from us again. This is no longer about charity or nostalgia. This is about power. Not to dominate others, but to define ourselves. And the door is open, wider than it has been in 400 years. All that remains is the choice. One seat at the table has waited 4 centuries. The question is, will you take it? 400 years ago, a wound was opened. It didn't just cut through skin, it severed memory, identity, belonging. It tore families from villages, cultures from languages, children from ancestors, and for centuries it taught us to forget where we came from, forget who we are to each other, forget that across the ocean someone was still looking up at the same stars, waiting. But now that waiting is over, not because of politics, not because of policy, but because one man, Ibrahim Traore, stood and said, "You were stolen, but never forgotten." And he meant it. Through him, we remembered what they hoped we'd never recall, that we are not lost, not broken, not divided. Beyond repair, we are one people, brilliant, battered, surviving, and now
Ready. Ready not to prove ourselves to systems never built for us, but to build systems made in our image. Ready not to beg for access, but to create our own doors and walk through them without apology. This is more than a reunion. This is Africa, rising. Rising not just in GDP or industry, but in soul, in pride, in memory, in family. And the question isn't whether this is real, and it already is. The question is, will you join it?
will you share this story with your children and grandchildren, not as a dream, but as a new chapter they must help write? Will you take your seat, the one reserved for 4 centuries, and make your ancestors proud? Because Ibrahim Traore isn't calling us back to yesterday. He's inviting us forward, one to the Africa our ancestors dreamed of. If this message stirred your soul, don't scroll past. Comment Africa Rise below, like, share, and most of all, subscribe. Not for content, but for a future that finally belongs to us.